The rain had been falling for 3 days without apology. It came in off the moors in gray curtains, soaking the lane that ran through Ashwick to a brown river of mud, filling the ruts left by cartwheels until the whole road shone like hammered pewter. The church spire disappeared into low cloud. The oak at the village green stood alone and dripping, its branches stripped to winter sticks, and the few souls who moved along the lane did so quickly. Heads down, collars raised, the village wearing its November face. And then, along that same lane, moving without urgency through the downpour, came a man on foot. He wore a coat that had once been good. A woman who knew wool could see it still, in the quality of the weave, in the way it held its shape despite the wet, in the particular cut of the collar that had once been fashionable and was not so very long ago. But the hem was frayed, the buttons were not all the same, and he wore no hat. His boots were caked past the ankle with red clay, and he walked with the measured pace of someone who had already decided not to hurry, because hurrying would not help him. He carried a leather satchel worn thin at the strap. He was, by every visible account, a man who had fallen a long way from somewhere, or a man who wished to appear so. The villagers of Ashwick noticed him as villagers will. Mrs. Hartwick pulled her curtain to the side and set it back. Old Fenwick, sweeping the step of the public house against all reason in the rain, looked up and looked away. The butcher's boy, carrying a basket across the green, went wide around him on the path, as one goes wide around a thing that might ask something of you. A woman with a basket on her arm watched him pass and said something low to the woman beside her, and both of them watched his back as he walked on. The man in the worn coat did not look at any of them. He walked to the end of the lane where the Ashwick Arms stood, pushed the door open, and went inside, bringing the cold smell of rain and damp wool with him. He asked for a room. The landlord, a man named Grover, with a red face and a habit of looking at a person's boots before their eyes, looked at the boots and quoted a price higher than was fair, the particular premium that innkeepers levy upon those who appear to have no alternative. The man paid it without argument from a thin purse, and Grover, who had expected argument, was briefly uncertain what to do with himself. The room given was the one at the back, above the kitchen, where the smell of boiled cabbage rose through the floor, and the window faced the privy yard, and the wind found every gap in the frame. It was the room for people who had no choice. It was into this room, the following morning, that Nora Baird was sent to bring water. She was 23 years old, a maid at the Ashwick Arms for 3 years since her father had died, and left the family cottage with a debt she could not have calculated, and a grief she was still working out how to carry. She was not the landlord's wife's first choice for tasks requiring delicacy, because she had a directness about her that made certain people uneasy. She said what she meant. She looked at a person rather than past them. She was not unfriendly, only honest, which in certain circles amounts to the same failing, and the Ashwick Arms was that kind of circle. Her hands were reddened from the cold water and the washing. Her dress was gray and plain and neatly kept. She moved through the inn's corridors with the competence of someone who had learned to occupy a space without apologizing for being in it. She knocked at the door of the back room. No answer came. She knocked again and said she had water, and the door opened. The man looked at her steadily. He was perhaps 35, with dark hair that had dried in a rough state from the rain and had not been attended to since. His face was lean, the jaw slightly unshaven, and his eyes were a particular shade of gray, like the sky just before the storm breaks, when the light is still present. But the color has drained from everything else. He wore a plain shirt, no coat, and he was holding a letter, which he folded and set aside with a movement that was careful and deliberate. The gesture of someone accustomed to putting things away. He looked like a man who had learned to hold himself still. "Thank you," he said. His voice was level and precise. Not the voice of a man who had spent his life in common rooms. Nora set the pitcher down on the washstand. She would have left then, but the fire in the hearth had gone out in the night, the grate cold and full of white ash, and it was her job to lay it. She knelt at the hearth and began to work, stacking the wood as she had stacked it 10,000 times, her hands competent and quick, her movements unhurried. He did not ignore her the way guests usually ignored maids, with the particular incuriosity of people for whom other people's labor is simply the house functioning correctly. He watched her, in a way she felt without seeing, the way one feels a candle burning behind one in a dark room, the warmth arriving before the light does. "The fire went out in the night," she said. It was not an apology. "I know," he said. "I did not bother to wake anyone." She glanced at him over her shoulder. That was unusual. Most guests who woke to a cold room would have rung and complained, or would have lain in martyred silence under insufficient covers and reported the deficiency to the landlord at breakfast with the satisfied misery of a man whose low expectations have been confirmed. "Are you comfortable enough otherwise?" she asked, because it was her habit to ask, and because she had already decided that what he was entirely his own affair. "Yes," he said. "Quite." She laid the fire and lit it, and watched the flame take hold along the edge of the kindling, before she was satisfied. She stood and smoothed her apron and picked up the empty water bucket. At the door, she paused. Not from sentiment, but because something practical had occurred to her. The kind of practical detail she noticed as a matter of habit. "The landlord will charge you extra for the coal if you let the fire go out and need it relayed more than once," she said. "He does not mention it until the bill." The man's expression did not precisely change, but something in it shifted, the way ice shifts when a new weight is placed on it, when the whole surface realigns itself around the alteration. "Thank you," he said again. This time it was different. It carried something more than courtesy. She left him to his fire. If you have ever found yourself stopping at a threshold without quite knowing why, you will understand what Nora Baird did not yet permit herself to understand. She went down to the kitchen and began her next task, and she did not think about the man in the back room. She was very thorough about not thinking about him, which is its own kind of thinking. He remained 4 days. In those 4 days, he ate in the public room at the hours it was least occupied, taking a corner seat near the window and reading from a slim volume he carried in his coat, or writing in a small notebook with quick, economical movements of his hand. He walked out in the mornings regardless of the rain, returning with muddy boots and a quietness about him that was different from the quietness of rest, more like the quietness of a man who has been taking inventory. He received one visitor, a thin man in a brown coat who arrived by horse from the south, and stayed less than an hour and left looking as though the conversation had proceeded in none of the directions he had planned. The man in the back room watched him go from the window. Nora saw his face at the glass when she crossed the privy yard with the linens. She did not look long, but she looked. On the second morning she brought his water again and found him at the table with a map spread out and weighted at the corners with his boots. It was a map of the county, careful and detailed, with several notations written in a small, clear hand in the margins. She did not read them. She set the pitcher down and was moving to leave when he spoke. "Is there a household north of the village?" he asked, without looking up from the map. "Something of size." "Ashwick Hall," she said. 2 miles on the Brackdale Road. It was Lord Moorcroft's estate." She paused. "He died in the autumn. The new lord has not yet arrived. The steward, a man named Hobbs, manages the property until he does." The man looked at the map. "What do they say of the new lord in the village?" This was an odd question from a traveler with clay on his boots and a thin purse, and Nora looked at him because she tended to look at things directly when they were odd. He was looking at the map, and not at her. "They say he has not come," she said carefully. "He inherited in October and has not been seen. The steward says he is detained in London. Mrs. Hartwick at the post office says he is in debt and too ashamed to show his face here. The vicar says nothing at all about it, which means he knows something he has decided not to share." The man refolded the map at a seam, his hands precise. "And what do you say?" "I say it is not my business," she said. "I say a man may have reasons for his delays that are not any of the three things the village has decided on." He looked up at her then, full, for a long moment, and she held his gaze for a breath before she picked up the empty bucket and left. Because she had other rooms to attend to, and she was not going to stand in a guest's doorway being looked at. On the third day, she brought his breakfast tray because the girl who usually carried trays had scalded her hand on the pot and was not fit to lift anything. He was seated at the window watching the lane below, where the rain had finally stopped and a thin winter light was coming through in pale strips. She set the tray on the table and poured his tea, which was the thing she disliked most about breakfast service: the pouring, the performance of attendance, the requirement to stand close beside a person and be invisible. She poured and straightened and was nearly at the door when he said, "Will you sit?" She turned. He was not looking at her as though it were a casual request, the way one asks a maid to adjust a window or bring another cup. He was looking at her the way one looks at a person one has thought about and decided to speak to honestly. "I am working," she said. "I know you are," he said. "I am asking anyway." It was not the way guests spoke to maids, and it was not the way anyone had spoken to her in 3 years, in any register she had been offered. She should have said that she was needed downstairs. She said instead, "A moment, then," and she sat in the chair by the hearth, which was burning steadily today because she had told him about the extra charge, and she had not quite allowed herself to notice that the fire staying lit all night was a consequence of that. "You said yesterday that a man may have reasons," he said. He was looking out the window, and his profile was quiet, the line of his jaw deliberate. "That the village has settled on 3 explanations, and you have settled on none." "I said it was not my business," she said. "You said 2 things," he said. "Not deciding is also a position." Nora looked at her hands in her lap. They were reddened from the cold water and the washing, the knuckles chapped in the way that did not fully heal between November and March, the nails kept short and without ornament. She was aware of them in the way one is aware of something that could be a source of embarrassment, if one were the sort of person who permitted things to be embarrassing. "My father," she said, "used to say that a man who cannot come home yet is still a man who wants to come home. He did not mean it as wisdom. He said it about a dog he had that had been frightened in a storm and would not come indoors for a week. Though it was cold, the dog eventually came in. He got there by his own road." She paused. "I have thought it was as true of people." The man was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a rook landed on the sill of the window below, and then decided against it, and departed. "Your father was a perceptive man," he said. "He was a farmer," she said. "He was practical. Perception and practicality are not so far apart as people in drawing rooms tend to think." He looked at her then, and she looked back, and neither of them said anything for a moment that ran a little longer than a moment has a right to run when it is between a guest and a maid in a common inn on a gray November morning in a village where nothing much happens. Then she stood and said she had to return to her work. And he said, of course. And she went down the stairs to the kitchen with her heartbeat doing something she did not particularly wish to examine. The village, meanwhile, had made up its mind about the man in the back room. "He was a debtor," said Mrs. Hartwick. He had the look of a man running from something, a specific guilty kind of walk that she had seen before, though she could not say when. "He was a soldier," said Fenwick, who said this about every man under 50 he did not immediately recognize, because it neatly accounted for the look of men who had learned to be still when stillness was required. "He was a confidence man," said Grover the landlord, who had decided to watch the fellow carefully, and had already composed a version of this concern that would reflect creditably on his own powers of discernment when the time came to share it at the market. What none of them saw, because none of them were looking in the right place, was the signet ring he wore on his right hand, turned inward so only the plain band showed when he reached for his cup. Nora had seen it the second morning when she was at the grate, and his hand had rested on the table beside the map at the angle that showed the setting. She had not looked twice, because whatever it signified was his to carry, and not hers to catalogue. She had noted it and set it aside. She was practical. On the evening of the third day, she carried his supper tray up herself, because Grover's wife had gone to bed with a headache, and the kitchen girl was afraid of the back staircase after dark, and would not be persuaded. He opened the door before she knocked, as though he had heard her step on the stair and was already at the door, which was the kind of detail a person noticed and then put away. "I have been thinking about what you said," he told her, as she set the tray and lifted the cover on the plate. "I have said a number of things," she said. "Which part?" "About the hall," he said. "About Hobbs managing it. About the roofs." She smoothed the cloth on the tray. "I did not say anything about the roofs." "No," he said. "That was the next morning, at the map. About the tenants on the North Farms." She had not realized he had remembered that so precisely. "Yes," she said. 3 of the cottages on the northern farms have had roof damage since before the old lord died. Hobbs applied to him twice and received no answer. The tenants are managing." She paused. "For now." "Is Hobbs a good man?" he asked. She thought about it in earnest, because he was asking in earnest, and she could hear the difference. "He is a careful man," she said. "He is not unkind. He takes the position seriously, and he manages the accounts correctly. From what I have heard from Mrs. Brierly, whose son works on the estate, whether he is good depends on what you want done with the property, and what needs doing, beyond the roofs. There is the well at the north end of the lane," she said, "that runs unreliably in the hard frosts, and the path through the south field that the children use to reach the school, which is a river of mud from October to April and could be made passable at small expense, and the drainage on the east field that flooded the Brierly cottage twice last winter." She stopped. "You did not ask me for a list." "I did not," he said, "but it is useful. Go on." She looked at him. He was watching her with the same attention he had given to the map. "There is nothing else I know of that is not simply ordinary country business," she said. "I am a maid at the public house. My knowledge of the estate is what the village says, and what Mrs. Brierly's son reports, which is not systematic. It is more than I had yesterday," he said. She smoothed her apron and picked up the empty tray cover. "You are not comfortable not being known," she said. It was not an accusation. It was something she had arrived at over 3 days and was setting down carefully, the way one sets down a lit candle. He was very still. Then quietly, "No, I find I am not." "Then perhaps," she said, "it is time to present yourself to Mr. Hobbs." She left him to his supper. On the morning of the 4th day, Nora went to lay the fire in the back room and found it empty. The bed was neatly made, which no guest had ever done in her 3 years at the Arms, the covers smoothed and the pillow set straight with the care of someone who had been a long time in the habit of leaving a place as he found it. The pitcher had been rinsed and set back on the washstand. The map was gone. The notebook was gone. The worn satchel was gone. On the table there was a folded note with her name written on the outside in small, clear handwriting. She opened it. Inside it said only, "Thank you for not deciding." Below that, written with slightly more deliberate pressure, "The Baron of Ashwick." She read it twice. She folded it and put it in her apron pocket, against the seam where the pocket was deepest. She laid the fire out of habit, though there was no one to use it, feeding the kindling into the grate with her usual competence, lighting it, watching it take. Then she went downstairs. "He is gone," she told Mrs. Grover. "I saw him leave at first light," said Mrs. Grover, who had a way of appearing to have known things she had in fact only just learned. A horse appeared from somewhere. He was decently dressed. Not as he arrived. She looked at Nora with the expression of a woman whose husband had been substantially wrong about something and was privately working out the most advantageous moment to raise the subject. He went north on the Brackdale Road. Nora said nothing. She went about her work. 2 weeks passed. The village received word through its usual channels, which moved faster than any post, that the new Baron of Ashwick had taken up residence at the Hall. He had presented himself to the steward on a Tuesday morning with a letter of authority from his London solicitor, had spent the first day walking the entire estate on foot, and had by the end of the week dispatched orders for the immediate repair of 3 tenant roofs before the hardest of the winter arrived. He had also, it was reported, asked to inspect the East Field drainage, the North Well, and the condition of the South Field path. Mrs. Hartwick pronounced him a serious young man. Fenwick said he had always suspected something of quality about the man in the arms, which was not precisely what he had said at the time, but was close enough for a village. Grover said nothing at all, which was a new development. Nora listened to all of it while she worked and kept her counsel. It was on a Wednesday morning 3 weeks after he had gone that a carriage stopped in the lane before the Ashwick Arms. It was a good carriage, plain but well maintained, and it bore no visible crest. A man got out, and the man was him. He was dressed properly now. A dark coat of good wool, correctly fitted, a white cravat, boots that had been cleaned and polished until the leather shone. He wore his signet ring outward, the crest visible, the gold catching the cold winter light. He looked exactly as he had in the back room, except that the outward fact of him now corresponded to what she had already known of him inside, and seeing those two things aligned produced in her an effect she did not take the time to name. He came into the public room, and Grover appeared with a speed that suggested he had been watching the lane. He was transformed, flushed with the particular warmth that rank produces in men who have previously been cold, the enthusiasm of a person retroactively correcting his own past behavior by the force of his present cordiality. "My lord," said Grover, with a depth of bow that had no precedent in Nora's 3 years of observation. "We are honored indeed. A fire in the good parlor at once. If it please you, Jane. The good parlor. My lord, whatever you require. We are at your service entirely." "I require a word with Miss Baird," said the Baron of Ashwick, in the same level, precise voice he had used in every conversation they had had together. "If she is not otherwise occupied." A silence fell over the public room in the way silences do when the established order has been gently tilted and no one yet knows which direction the water will run. The farmhands at the far table set down their cups. The woman by the window stopped her knitting. Grover stood with his mouth slightly open. Nora was at the far end of the room, carrying a basket of folded cloths she had brought from the laundry. She did not pretend she had not heard. She looked at him, and he looked at her. And it was the same look they had traded across the washstand and across the breakfast tray and across the inch of scarred wood in the evening firelight. and it meant the same thing it had always meant. "I am not otherwise occupied," she said. He waited, with the patience she had come to recognize as a deliberate choice rather than passivity. And she crossed the room and they went into the small parlor, and Grover shut the door on them, which he would remember for the remainder of his life, as the moment he fully understood the nature and magnitude of his error. The parlor was warm and smelled of old wood and the settled ghost of 20 years of fires. He stood with his back to the window, and she stood in the center of the room with the basket of cloths still in her hands, because she had not thought to set it down. "I came to tell you something," he said. "All right," she said. "I came to Ashwick as I did," he said, "because I did not know whether I could manage it. The estate, the title, the whole weight of the thing. My father and I were not, by the end of his life, on easy terms. I had been away from this county a long time, and by choice. And then he died, and the choice was made for me." He paused. The light from the window was on his face. "I arrived without announcing myself because I wanted to see the place clearly. The land, the people in it. I wanted to hear what they actually thought, rather than what they thought I wished to hear." A pause. "I found that one person did not adjust what she said for my benefit. She said what was true, including things that were not convenient to hear. She treated me as a man who might be worth speaking honestly to, and nothing more, and nothing less." "You were worth speaking honestly to," Nora said. "Most people are, if you give them the chance to show it. You did not know who I was." "I knew who you were," she said. "I did not know your title. Those are not the same thing. You established that yourself." He looked at her with that gray, particular attention. "Yes," he said quietly. "They are." He was quiet for a moment longer, and then he said, in the voice he used when he had decided something and was not reconsidering, "I am having considerable difficulty imagining how to manage the hall without someone who is able to speak plainly to me when plain speaking is required. The steward is capable, but he has spent years managing an old man's preferences, and he tells me what will not disturb me. I find I have no use whatsoever for what will not disturb me." "I imagine not," she said. "What I am proposing," he said carefully, "is not precisely what I am proposing. What I am proposing first is that I would like to know you better, under circumstances in which you are not carrying water, and I am not pretending to be something I am not. I am aware that what I am, in fact, proposing, beneath the surface of that, is something I am not yet in a position to name directly without having earned the right to name it. I am naming the outline. I am leaving the interior for a later conversation, when the outline has been properly established." Nora set the basket of cloths down on the settle. She smoothed her apron, which was a habit and not a performance. She looked at him. "That is the most carefully constructed indirect proposal I have ever had occasion to hear," she said. Something moved in his face. It was very nearly amusement, and it changed him, briefly, into a man 10 years younger and considerably less careful. "I am practicing," he said. "You should come to dinner," she said. "Here, in the public room, where it is ordinary. You can tell me about the estate, and I will tell you what the village says of it. And you will hear a number of things Hobbs has not reported, and that will be a reasonable place to begin." He looked at her for a moment, and then, "Thursday." "Thursday," she said. He picked up his hat from the chair where he had set it. At the door he paused, and he said quietly, "Thank you, Miss Baird, for the fire, for what you said about the dog." "It was practical advice," she said. "Yes," he said. "It was." He left. She stood in the parlor, her hand resting on the back of the settle, breathing carefully, which required considerably more effort than it should have from a woman who did nothing but practical things. Thursday came with frost on the window panes and a pale winter sky that held its blue for the first time in weeks. He arrived at 6:30, on foot, without ceremony. And he sat in the public room at the table nearest the fire, which was not the best table and not the worst. And when Nora brought his meal, she sat across from him, because Grover had instructed her to see to the gentleman's comfort, and this, she had decided, was the correct interpretation of those instructions. He told her about the East Field, which had been underworked for 2 seasons and would want attention in the spring. He told her about the roof slates on the Briarley cottage, replaced on Thursday afternoon by 2 men from the village he had engaged on Hobbs's recommendation. He told her about the library, which was vast and cold and contained his father's books in their thousands, and his voice when he spoke of it was careful in the way his hands were careful when he folded a letter, containing something he had not yet decided how to hold. She told him about the Briarley family, including the grandmother who had sewn for the old lord's household for more than 40 years, and who would, Nora was certain, work herself past all endurance in gratitude for the roof, without being asked, and without any thought that gratitude was being performed. She told him about the north well and the hard frosts. She told him about the children's path through the south field, and he took out his notebook and wrote something in it. She told him about Mrs. Aldridge on Peel Lane, who had managed a house in Derbyshire for 12 years and had come home to her sister last spring and was applying her considerable capacities to nothing in particular. He hired Mrs. Aldridge by the following week. When the fire had burned down and the room had emptied of everyone except the 2 of them, and Grover pretending to require an unusual degree of attention at the far end of the bar, he said, without looking up from his cup, "I owe you an apology." "You do not," she said. "I withheld something significant about myself," he said. "You withheld a title," she said. "You did not withhold yourself. Those are different things. You said so already, and I agreed with you at the time, and I have not changed my position." He looked up. The firelight was on his face, and the gray of his eyes was darker and quieter in this light. Something in it that she recognized as the look a person wears when they have been carrying something heavy and have found, unexpectedly, a place where they might set it down. "Nora," he said. Her name, in his voice, at that particular volume, was almost a different word than the one Grover used when he called her across the room. She had not told him to use it. He had used it anyway, and it landed differently than names usually land. "If we are going to continue having conversations of this kind," she said, "then yes, that is correct." His hand was on the table. He moved it, slowly, toward hers. Not touching, an inch of scarred wood between them. The firelight moved across the distance between their hands, which was not far, and which was very much. She did not move her hand away. There is a quiet that comes after a moment like that, a quiet that belongs to the 2 people in it and resists description after the fact. Grover, at the far end of the bar, cleaned the same glass 3 times in succession and discovered that the far wall was unexpectedly interesting. The weeks that followed were the subject of considerable attention in Ashwick. He came to the Arms on Thursday. Then on a Tuesday as well. Then on a Thursday and a Tuesday, and once on a Friday morning only to ask whether she knew who might manage the Hall's household properly before the winter deepened further, and she told him about Mrs. Aldridge, whom he had already hired, and he said he knew about Mrs. Aldridge. He had come to tell her that Mrs. Aldridge had said she wished to thank Miss Baird for the recommendation, and Nora said that was very kind of Mrs. Aldridge and unnecessary, and he said it was both, and that was the end of that visit, which had accomplished nothing practical, and which she thought about for the remainder of the afternoon. The village watched all of it with the full force of its attention. The Baron of Ashwick calling on the maid at the public house, the maid at the public house sitting across from the Baron of Ashwick at the table nearest the fire. The conversations that went on longer than any conversation between an innkeeper's servant and a lord of the county had any ordinary business going. Mrs. Hartwick said what she said, in the tone that contained the complete architecture of her opinion. Young Tom Aldridge, 12 years old and newly conscious of his mother's position at the hall, said what he said with the authority of someone who has recently acquired information. Fenwick revised his entire account of the first sighting. What the village did not see, through any window or curtain, was the conversation that took place on the last Thursday of December, when the frost was the thickest it had been, and the fire in the public room was the only warmth for a quarter-mile. He told her about the letter his father had written, the year his mother died, that he had received and not read, and finally opened only after his father was buried, and what the letter said that had taken him so long to learn to carry. And she told him about the debt her father had left behind, the cottage she had grown up in sold to settle accounts, her mother installed with a cousin in Thornbury, and how she had never once wished her father had been a different kind of man, because wishing for a better manager would have been wishing away the man who had taught her to lay a fire and to read a letter and to say the true thing, even when the true thing cost something. And she had loved that man exactly as he was. He had been still and listening in the way she had come to know he listened, completely, without performance. And then he had reached across the table and set his hand over hers, and this time it was her doing. It was deliberate, a thing she had decided and was executing, and his hand had turned under hers and held it, and they had sat like that in the thinning fire with the frost on the window and the village quiet outside, and neither of them had spoken, because neither of them had needed to. January. He came to her at the market stall by the village green on a Tuesday morning when she was buying meal. He came on foot, in his good coat, without ceremony or announcement, and he stood beside her while she counted her coin with the care she always gave to counting coin, because she always had exactly enough, and not a penny more, and the transaction required her full attention. When it was done, he said, in the same level voice he used for every important thing, "I would like to ask you something." "Ask it," she said. "I would like to ask you to marry me," he said. "Not the title, not the hall. Me." The man who walked in from the rain and said he was comfortable enough when he was not, and paid Grover's inflated price without complaint because he had no standing to complain, and kept the fire going all night after a maid told him the extra charge, and has not since been able to manage with any efficiency whatsoever without the advice and the plain speaking, and the company of that same woman. He paused. "I am not always easy. I have a library full of my father's books and have not yet opened a single one. I am working out what I inherited along with the estate, which is more than the land. I find I would rather work it out with you than without you." Around them the market continued its business, indifferent and complete. A woman called the price of winter parsnips. A dog threaded between two stalls. Somewhere behind them, at a close and impractical distance, Mrs. Hartwick had stopped moving entirely. Nora looked at him in the way she always looked at things that mattered, directly, without adjustment. "I said at the beginning that what you were was not my business," she said. "I remember," he said. "I have revised that position considerably," she said. "Is that a yes?" "That is a yes," she said. He did not make a scene of it. He did not take her hand before the parsnip vendor or speak further in a volume the village could report with precision. He looked at her in the way he had looked at her since the morning she laid his fire, and she looked back in the way she had always looked at things she was not pretending not to see. And then he said he would speak to no one she would not wish spoken to first, and she said she would tell her mother before anyone else. And he said, of course. And they parted, and she finished her marketing with steady hands, and he walked back up the Brackdale Road. Her mother received the news with 3 minutes of silence, followed by weeping that was not unhappy, only too large for the ordinary size of the afternoon. Nora held her mother's hands and waited, because she had learned from a practical farmer and a practical farmer's wife that a great many things settle themselves if you give them the time to settle. The announcement appeared in the county register in the 2nd week of February. The village received it through Mrs. Hartwick's particular system of distribution and managed to arrive, collectively, at the position that they had always perceived something in Miss Baird. A quality, a steadiness, a particular way of seeing things clearly that was perhaps unusual, and that it was no surprise to those who had been paying proper attention. Grover, to his lasting credit, said nothing publicly at all. The wedding took place in March, at the church at the end of the lane where the rain had fallen the day he arrived, in a ceremony quiet and deliberate, as both of them preferred their important things to be. Mrs. Aldridge came down from the hall with 3 of the tenant wives and old Mrs. Brierly, who wore her Sunday coat with an expression of such satisfaction that it bordered on triumph. Young Tom Aldridge held the door and considered it the most significant event of his life so far. The vicar, who had known something since October and had said nothing, performed the service with a warmth that bordered on vindication. Nora wore cream, with long gloves that fit, that were new, that no one had worn before her. She stood at the altar and looked at the man who had come in from the rain in a frayed coat and paid a price that was too high without complaint, and rinsed his own pitcher and made his bed before he left. And she thought about a folded note, and a fire she had laid for no one, and an inch of wood in the firelight. He took her hands. His ring was outward. The church smelled of cold stone, and the first faint note of early spring pressing in under the doors, and the plain windows let in a gray and honest light, the same quality of light that had been falling on Ashwick the morning he arrived, the light that showed things as they were without flattery or improvement. It was not a dramatic light. It was exactly the right light. The vicar spoke his words. They spoke theirs. Outside, the rook that lived in the oak at the village green landed on the churchyard wall and regarded the ceremony with the equanimity of a creature that has seen many seasons change and is not moved by the ceremonies that mark them. In the hall that evening, in the library, a fire burned in the hearth that had been cold for a long time. The room smelled of wood smoke and old paper and the accumulated quiet of a great many years. She moved along the shelves with one hand trailing across the spines, titles in Latin and French and English, collections of correspondence, volumes of natural history, a set of sermons, an almanac for a year long past, the whole accumulated evidence of a man she had not known. He stood in the doorway and watched her do it, this woman who counted her coin carefully and said the true thing and laid fires for no one who asked, and had looked at a man in a worn coat and seen what was there rather than what was absent. "We should read them," she said, not looking at him. "Yes," he said. "We should." She drew out a volume from the shelf, Pauper's letters, and brought it to the chair nearest the fire, and he came and settled in the chair beside her, and outside the window, the first stars were arriving over the moors, and the lane below was dry and still, and in the Ashwick Arms the fire was burning, and the room was its ordinary, unremarkable self. And Grover was polishing glasses that did not require polishing, as he had done every evening since February. The note was in her desk now, in the small room she had made her own at the back of the hall, the room that looked out toward the moors. She had not thrown it away. She did not intend to. What had happened was not a large thing, if you counted only the visible parts. A man had come in from the rain. A woman had laid his fire and said the true thing, as she had always done, as she had no mechanism for not doing. And the true thing, when someone has the patience to say it, and someone else has the courage to receive it, changes what comes after. If you have stayed this long with a woman who did not expect to be found, leave a word for her in the quiet below. She would not ask. She never did. She opened the book. The firelight moved across the page. He did not look at the book. He looked at her. She turned the first page.